Hello everybody, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA, and for those of you who don't know, Reformed GGA is a channel where I basically talk about the things that I like to talk about as they pertain to guns and ammunition and stuff like that. Now, some people get kind of annoyed and weirded out by the fact that not only do I wind up talking about guns and ammunition, but I also wind up talking about a number of other things, some of them political as it relates to guns, and sometimes not. But more important than anything else is the fact that I incorporate my personal religious faith into basically everything that I do to one extent or another. I am a Reformed Christian. That's where the Reformed and Reformed GGA comes from. And because I'm first and foremost a Christian, that winds up influencing everything else that I do in life, including talking about guns and things like that. So don't be surprised when that pops up in these videos. It's going to happen. It's just part of life. Okay, that's who I am. I'm a Reformed Christian and I act like it. I believe in the God who is sovereign over every area of life, and I act like it. But without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into taking a look at the star of our little show this time. This is the Grand Power Stribog, and I am fairly impressed with it. Now, some people might correct me on that one and say that it's Stribog instead of Stribog. I've heard it pronounced both ways. I've not seen anything official from the company saying how it should be pronounced, and so I'm just going with Stribog. If it happens to be Stribog, so be it, and excellent, go with that. But I haven't seen anything official on it, so I'm just going to go with Stribog because that's the one that I seem to have heard most recently that stuck in my brain. Alright, but this is my most recent gun that I've gotten, and I have had the chance to do a little bit of test firing it with it. I still want to stretch out his legs a little bit more, but I have had a chance to test it out a little bit, and I've formed a few initial opinions on it. Now, a little bit of history on this. Not on the gun itself, but the reason why I got the gun is basically that I was looking to expand my collection, as I often am, and in particular I was looking for a gun that would travel a little bit better than my current traveling bedside gun. And I'll go ahead and bring that up here just so that we have it for comparison. My current traveling bedside gun, which is currently loaded and doing its duty, is a CZ Scorpion S1 in the carbine version, no faux suppressor because I don't roll like that. But this is my current traveling bedside gun, and when the stock on it is folded up, it actually becomes a fairly small package, and I really like it. It does a good job at what it's supposed to do. And one of the main things I like about pistol caliber carbines over something like say an AR that has a folding stock, because you actually can get ARs with that. The reason why I like these ones though is because they tend to be back heavy rather than front heavy. Even with a fairly long barrel on there, this one is pretty well balanced on my primary hand instead of on my sport hand. My sport hand, when I'm shouldering it, really is just there for support. My primary hand is taking the primary brunt of the weight, and that allows me to hold on target for a longer period of time. It's effective in a particular way that's important to me. We'll leave it at that. But this gun is still kind of long. Yes, the stock folds, but it's got a 16-inch barrel on there, plus the primary body of the gun. Not the best traveling gun in the world. It works, but not the best. And so I started looking into other options of, other things that could travel with me that would be a little bit smaller. The biggest area, of course, is getting rid of a lot of the barrel length. That's where most of the length of this gun is. And but I didn't want to take off too much. I still wanted to have good ballistic performance. And for 9mm, which is what I usually use just because it's a very cheap, inexpensive round, it's good for centerfire rounds. It's a good recreational round because it's relatively inexpensive and it can double in a self-defense role. It's not super powerful, a 223, 5.56, 7.62 by 39, 5.45 by 39. All those ones are going to be, they're intermediate rifle cartridges, 300 blackout, all those ones. Those are definitely going to be a lot more powerful, but not as cheap as running 9mm, for sure. And if your primary purpose of use is recreational and only with the self-defense parts of it being secondary, it makes sense to go with the cheaper round. So most of my guns are primarily recreational, secondary self-defense, but I still like to have decent ballistic performance out of that 9mm if I can get it. And 16 inches is actually a little long for 9mm. Most 9mm rounds will optimize somewhere between a 6-inch barrel and a 12-inch barrel. You start going beyond that, and you've expended all the energy in the cartridge itself, and you're just adding extra barrel length past that, which adds friction. And so you actually wind up slowing the bullet down. And so 6 to 12 inches is what I was going for, and Scorpion does make a version that's like 7 3/4 inches long for their version, but I didn't feel super great about doing that one, because even though that would be the barrel length I want, the central frame of the gun, from the magwell to the back of the handle, is still fairly large on a CZ Scorpion. And then in profile, it's also a relatively thick gun. So handling characteristics are really nice, but it's not super travelable as much as I would prefer. And so I wound up stumbling upon the Stribog, the focus of our attention right now. And despite all the hoopla that's been happening with the Stribog recently in the internet, I was actually planning on getting this for quite some time. This gun has actually been out on the market for quite some time. It was just a matter of me getting around to it. I was kind of looking at my collection and saying, yeah, what would be a cool addition? I've already got a Czech gun, that is Czech Republic, and it would be kind of nice to have a Slovakian gun as well. And so it made sense, and I forget how I first stumbled upon it. I think it was actually one of Such's videos, because he's done a couple on the Stribog. Like I said, it could also be pronounced Stribog. I'm not sure which it is. I haven't heard anything official from Grand Power on it, and the Grand Power is the company that makes it. So, be that as it may, but not really sure where exactly I got it, but I think it was from Such, and saw one of his videos on it. It's like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting, and I looked up the stats and the dimensions on it, and it turns out that the main frame from magwell to the grip is just a little bit smaller, and so with roughly the same size barrel, this is about an 8-inch barrel, for roughly the same size barrel, it gets just a little bit less length, which makes it just that much more travelable. And then also in profile, it's not as wide as the CZ Scorpion is either. So again, another feature that makes it a little bit more travelable. Okay, now I'm not necessarily recommending that everybody, for their travel guns, they get 9mm guns and that kind of thing. That's a personal decision that you're going to have to make. Like I said, my primary thing with my guns is that they're primary recreational, and so I like relatively cheap ammo. And then I also like to have guns that I can freehand with my dominant hand for prolonged periods of time if I want to. If you want to hear a little bit more about that, look up the video that I did saying that ARs are good, but not my go-to. That's a video that's on my channel relatively recently. I think it was actually the video right before this one. But if you're interested in exactly why I'm not a huge fan of doing the intermediate caliber thing, and especially ARs in general, take a look at that one. But the concerns that I have don't necessarily apply to everyone, so I'm not making any blanket suggestions, certainly. But for me, this is something that I was interested in, kind of on the side of wanting to expand the collection to include something that was Slovakian to go with the Czech gun, but also because it does fill that niche of being a little bit more travel friendly than the CZ Scorpion is, and still get decent, for 9mm that is, but decent ballistic performance considering the caliber and those kinds of things. And so I finally saw one in a store recently, and so I picked it up. Like I said, I've been planning on getting it for quite a while, but recently saw one in a store that was in a price range that I could at least kind of get into. This is going to wind up being a project gun. As you can see, it's missing something. There's nothing on the back end. Also doesn't have any optics or anything like that yet, so it's definitely going to be a little bit of a project gun. But it turns out that it actually does better in this configuration than I thought it did. It does actually have little flip-up sights, And in this configuration, by the way, the flip-up sights are virtually useless because it's a rear peep, and in order to actually use the peep well enough, you actually have to get pretty close to it, and that's, if you don't have a brace or a stock on there or something like that, that's pretty much going to smack you in the nose distances right there. But it turns out that when you take the pop-up sights and you flip them down, it has more or less typical handgun sights. So there's a front post, and then on the back there's a little notch, and if you hold out a little bit of distance, they line up pretty well and you can get decently accurate shots. I was actually really surprised that these little notch sights worked as well as they do. I'm not saying that I think you should use them as your primary sights or anything like that, I'm not, but they do work a lot better than I thought they would. When I was out there shooting with it, I was actually out shooting yesterday, which is good because today it wound up snowing, which was annoying. But yesterday I was out shooting, and I had one of my 9mm actual handguns with me, a little Bursa TPR 9C. And then I also had the CZ Scorpion, and of course it has a stock, it has an optic, and things like that. And it turns out that this thing was basically in the middle of the other two in terms of effective range. My Bursa TPR 9C, occasionally I can shoot at, 25 yards with it, but not really overly consistently. I'm a lot more comfortable within maybe 15 yards. And the CZ Scorpion, on the rare occasion I can take it out to 100 yards, but more like 75 yards and under. And this one, in this configuration, I didn't have an optic on it or anything, just using the little post and notch sights on it. 25 yards was actually pretty doable. So a little bit beyond what my pistol was. Not super far, but a little bit beyond my pistol. Not as far as I can get with, proper sights and a stock. But it did actually wind up being better than a normal handgun for me, which I thought was rather surprising. I did not expect that. When I went out there, all that I really intended to do was basically just function test it, put a bunch of rounds through it, make sure that it can eat a few different kinds of ammo. That's all that I was really intending to do with it, but it's no fun just shooting nothing, and so I started using the sights that it came with. Not that they're great, but started using them, and it turns out I could actually connect with it. 4-inch targets, as long as you're within 25 yards or so, actually is pretty doable, even with the really, frankly, cheap and not overly great little notch sights that it has. And these sights really are very cheap. They're just plastic. That's all that they are. They're definitely nothing fancy. I don't anticipate them lasting for a super long time or anything like that. But they're relatively close, at least within that range. And it was basically a lot like regular handgun sights. It was basically about a 6 o'clock hold. You hold a little under the target and shoot, and it was fine. Like I said, 4-inch targets within 25 yards, very doable with this gun. Even without the brace, even without the optic, not bad. Better than I thought it was going to be. Like I said, I was just intending to function check. So turns out it wasn't all bad. But like I said, I have actually managed to get some rounds through it, and I have formed some opinions on it, so I want to share those with you guys. But the summary of it really could be better than expected. And a lot of people, especially given the recent internet hype with this, will say, well, why wouldn't you expect it to be good? There's been plenty of reviews out there that have been fairly positive. What would make you think that it's not good? Well, what would make me think that it's not good is that it's a Yugoslavian gun versus a Czech gun. Sorry, I have back problems, and so I keep popping. But be that as may. But it's a Yugoslavian gun versus a Czech gun, and lots of Yugoslavian guns don't exactly have the best reputation in the world. They're not necessarily terrible, but they usually don't have a reputation for being great either. And then when you look at how the gun is actually constructed, and I'll walk you through that, there are some parts of it that are just flat out cheap. Like I said, for example, these cheapo little pop-up sights are part of what is really cheap. These are just plastic, and they've got, looks like a little roll pin that's holding them in place, which is not overly great construction at all. Not exactly longest lasting construction, but functional enough. And of course this thing does come in at a price point that's usually lower than the CZ Scorpion is, and with lower price points usually comes lower quality. So I didn't anticipate this thing being super duper great, and it's still not super duper great, but it was better than expected. So let's go ahead and talk about the features overall. Let's just go ahead and start with the negatives. I'll go right to the thing that I hate the most, and to do that I'm going to have to open up the gun. There's just a little pin at the back that you pull out, and then, as long as you actually pull it out properly, it basically opens up more or less like an AR does. And that's actually on the kudos, but we'll leave kudos for kudos. But the thing that annoys me the most, I'm not sure how well you guys can see it. See if I can hold it next to my face. It looks like there's, well, let's see here. Trying to get a good camera shot on it is relatively difficult. I don't know if you guys can see it, but there is a little piece of, it kind of looks like a stray piece of spring metal, just a little, see if I can pull on it there. There you go. Right under my index finger, there's this little stray piece of metal. That is actually the spring for the bolt catch. The bolt stop relies on that stupid little piece of spring metal that just sits there in the receiver, out in the open. If nothing screams ghetto to you, that should. That is definitely a ghetto design right there. You know, we don't really have a proper mechanism in place to hold the bolt catch down, so we'll just put a little piece of spring metal right there and do that with it. And frankly, I hate that little piece of spring metal. It is so annoying when you go to clean the gun, because I usually use a bore snake, and so I feed the bore snake in, yank it through, and the bore snake will get caught on that little piece of metal, and it'll bend it out of place, and then it won't work like it's supposed to, and you have to rebend it and all those kinds of things. It's just a terrible design. I've never seen a gun that took care of the bolt stop that way, and the reason why your bolt stop is going to have a spring on it is so that when it's not in use, it's held out of the way and it doesn't wind up interfering with the gun. It's a good thing to have a spring on the bolt stop, but that right there, that's just all kinds of janky. That is ghetto as ghetto can be. That is an awful design. I don't care what anybody says. That should never have even been considered. Alright, so that is definitely something that I do not like about it. And then while we're on the subject, let's talk about the bolt stop itself. This right here is the bolt stop. And as you can see, that's just a folded piece of sheet metal that has had the end of it flared out. That is your bolt stop. That is cheap. That is as cheap gets right there. We know how to work with sheet metal, and we can bend things, and we can flare it, and so there we go. Definitely cheap. Another thing is the plastic that the lower receiver is made up, and it is plastic, the lower receiver. The upper receiver is actually aluminum, so that part's good, but the lower receiver is plastic. But they didn't use a very good plastic, and so what they had to do in order to get all the components to work right in it is inside, I don't know if you can actually see it move, but inside they actually put a metal chassis for the hammer and trigger assembly to work. And you should be able to see the trigger move there. Yeah. Now when the gun is closed up, you don't get that movement, or it doesn't become a problem that way, but that's just how cheap the gun is. And by the way, it's basically rotating around the safety, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But very cheap plastic, and so their solution to have something that would hold is to put it in a little metal chassis. Very simple kind of pin kind of design, just cheap. You know, instead of getting a really good plastic and actually have parts embedded into it to hold it real well, they just did with this design, and it's not necessarily terrible. It's not like it's not going to work, but they were definitely trying to save themselves some money on manufacturing by doing it that way. Not a big fan of that. Another thing while we're at it, is I might as well talk about the back of the bolt. I'm not a big fan of that. take off the back plate here. And by the way, for those of you who are wondering how I took off the back plate, it's actually a relatively simple design. You're going to push it out, but while you're pushing out, you push down. So I'm going to use my thumb to push out, have my hand there to make sure I hold it down. It'll slide not even 1/4 of an inch, and then you can pull it out. So not a big thing that way. But pull out the bolt here, and what I want you to notice is that on the bolt it has these little rubber pads on each side. It has basically 2 buffers on it. But as you can see, these rubber pads are loose. Now when they're actually in the receiver of the gun, they're stable enough to work, but they're not super well fixed to the end, and they wiggle and they do weird things, and they come off, and you can lose them if you're not careful. And so, not a huge fan of that. Now, it's not necessary to take them off, but they do come off. So yeah, not a fan of that at all. Put that back together. So yeah, so far I'm not a fan of the spring that is used to activate the bolt catch. The bolt catch itself is just a piece of sheet metal. The buffers that are on the back of the bolt come loose and they come off, and those kinds of things. The flip-up sights are just plastic. They're nothing great. It turns out that they work better than I thought they would, but not super great. The lower receiver is plastic, and it's a relatively cheap plastic, and so they had to do basically a metal drop-in piece for the trigger and hammer assembly. And so you can just see in looking at the gun that this is not super high quality parts. They went with what would be relatively cheap to use. And while we're on that subject, we might as well talk about the magazines that it came with. These magazines are relatively thin plastic, and the feed lips on them are also relatively thin. So these are not magazines that I would leave loaded for prolonged periods of time. This is definitely a case where you want to trade out your ammo between magazines if you're not regularly shooting it up. How often? Given how thin those are, probably at least once a month, if not more often. Trade out your magazines. You know, 1 month you use this magazine over here, and then you trade out to another magazine that you use for the other month, just to make sure that you don't put too much wear and tear on those lips. And if a magazine doesn't need to be loaded with this gun, you probably shouldn't load it, because those feed lips are very, very, very weak. And then just in the side, it's of course translucent, and you can see that the follower has spring pretty much right under it. That follower is extremely, extremely thin, and again, relatively cheap plastic as well. This is not a super high quality follower at all. Very cheap. And then this design is vertical, and vertical magazines can have, when they're in this particular configuration, because it's a stagger stack, it feeds from either side, which does help with reliability in some regards, but the straight design is a little bit hard on 9mm, and it will especially cause rounds to drag along the front side. And so there are certain rounds that I would definitely not recommend in this gun. I haven't tried every kind of round that's out there, obviously, but there are some kinds of rounds that, based on this design and what I've seen with it do with the rounds that I have put through it, there are certain kinds of rounds that I would just not recommend, and most of those are the ones that have oddly shaped front ends. Because in this magazine, the front end of the bullet is going to drag on the front side of the magazine a little bit, and it's polymer, it's just plastic, not, you know, super, doesn't exactly have a high lubricity. You know, if things get caught on it, it'll stick, and it'll bind up, and it'll cause the magazine not to feed properly. And so any kind of bullet that has a really weird shaped front end, for example, the Lehigh Defender and Penetrator rounds, the front end of them looks kind of like a Phillips screwdriver. Those I would not recommend putting in a magazine like this, just because that weird front shape and the fact that that front shape is going to be dragging across the front of the magazine. Probably not a good idea. And then also like the RIP rounds that have that really aggressive fractating round on it that has just all those little jagged pieces out in front. Wouldn't recommend that in this magazine either. That being said, I did test it with, of course, a few different kinds of ball ammunition, and it seemed to work just fine with those. Worked it with aluminum case, and it worked out fine. I did use my preferred carry rounds, which are the Fort Scott munitions, basically spear point solid copper rounds, and it did work fine with those in these mags. So no major issues on any of those, but the stranger bullet designs I would definitely be very leery of with mags like this. Round nose, not an issue. The spear points, at least the ones from Fort Scott, seem to do just fine. And I would imagine that a lot of the hollow points, as long as the edges of their hollow points are actually rounded instead of flat. Sorry, you guys that like to do American Gunner ammunition with that really flat cone shape on the front, might not be so great. But hollow points, as long as the side of the bullet itself actually curves a little bit, you should be okay with. But the really weird designs, like the Lehigh Defender and Penetrator rounds, wouldn't recommend it. The RIP ammunition, wouldn't recommend it. These magazines are prone to binding on the front end, and the basic overall construction is pretty cheap. Now, I will give credit where credit is due in saying that the spring that they used in there is actually, as far as I can tell, a very high quality spring. It is a good, solid piece of stainless spring steel, and has really good retention, resistance, I should say, not retention. Good solid resistance on it. Don't have any concerns about the spring wearing out. What I would be much more concerned about is the follower is definitely a little weak, and then those feed lips. Those feed lips are very, very, very chintzy. So I wouldn't want to leave a magazine loaded with those feed lips for too long. My basic philosophy is, if the magazine doesn't need to be loaded, don't load it. And if you do have loaded magazines, trade out from time to time so that you don't have that constant pressure on it, just slowly, forcing those polymer fibers apart, which will eventually crack it. And people have had problems with magazines like this in the past. When CZ first came out with the Scorpion, people were cracking the feed lips on those all the time, and people still do from time to time, but they learned to get a little bit more reinforced feed lips on them, and mostly just thicker plastic. And there are companies out there that also make metal reinforced CZ Scorpion mags, and those are nice. But so far with these ones, they haven't done that yet. So like I said, if it doesn't need to be loaded, don't load it. So yeah, lots about things about this that are just cheap, and that's part of why I bought it, is because it was in budget and I could add things to it later on and fix it up like I wanted it to. But yeah, lots of parts of it that are just cheap and kind of janky. But there are also some very good things, and I want to make sure that I give credit where credit is due. We'll just kind of start from the back end here and move forward. First of all, it is not nearly as difficult to take apart as I thought it was going to be. I was looking at some people with earlier models of the Stribog doing field strips on it and having to take apart this backplate, and I saw some people would actually go ahead and use rubber mallets and things like that to force it down and out. And turns out that as long as you apply a little bit of downward pressure to it, it actually slides out pretty easily, and it's not hard to use at all. And so give them kudos for that one. They either have fixed the problem, or the person that I saw who reviewed it before me, who was using a rubber mallet, just simply like their rubber mallet, I guess. But the takedown on it, as you guys saw, actually isn't that bad. There's one push pin. That's not terrible. Put the really, really, really chintzy side out of the way, and then push down and out. Use the charging handle to pull up on the bolt, and that's it. That's all the parts that you have. You have the gun, you have the back plate, you have the bolts, and that's it. That is pretty good design. And while we're on the inside here, let's take a look at that bolt. And I do want to comment on the fact that I actually really do like this design. Telescoping bolts Telescoping bolts is where you have the face of the bolt that actually holds the bullet is way back here, and then the main mass of the bolts extends past that. It telescopes past that. That's what a telescoping bolt is. It has a really big front end on it. Telescoping bolts are a really great idea for blowback guns. One, it allows you to put a lot of mass into the bolts, which blowback guns are going to need, but it also allows you to maintain a fairly thin overall profile while doing that. So if you want a fairly thin gun, which a lot of people like, and you want to have a really nice heavy bolt in there to catch the recoil, to keep the chamber from opening up too quickly, etc., etc., telescoping bolt is a real good way to go. And this gun, compared to my Scorpion, does not recoil as bad. Even though I don't have the stock on this thing, or a brace on it, or whatever it winds up happening being down the line, I can feel that there is a definitely marked difference in the recoil signatures between the two guns. Yep, firing the same ammunition and all that. This gun, the Stribog, definitely has a smaller recoil impulse. It's still blowback, and so it's not going to be as nice as like the roller delay system or some of the gas systems that are out there. But for blowback, this telescoping bolt is really, really nice. Okay, so if you're going to have a relatively cheap gun, telescoping bolt is a good way to get better performance out of it without significantly changing the cost of the gun, etc., etc. Now, they did cheat a little bit on this one in that it is a dual mass bolt. The bottom part of it actually slides out, and that was basically just done to make manufacturing get easier, because milling something out in this shape would be somewhat difficult, and so they basically made it in two parts that slide together, and you can actually see the seams in there. I don't know how good we are, but you can actually see the seams in there, and it really does just slide. It's not held in. I can move it with my hand if I want to. Yeah, there you go. Now you can really see it. But yeah, so kind of cheap manufacture there, but if you're going to do a cheap blowback operated system, telescoping bolt is a good way to go, which the CZ Scorpion doesn't have. It doesn't have a telescoping bolt. It's all on the back end, and that's why its frame is a little bit longer, is because you have to fit more on the back end to make it work. This actually is a good design. If you're going to do something relatively cheap and you want to get a little bit higher performance out of it, telescoping bolts, and yeah, the dual mass thing it's there to save money, but it works. And there's a lot of other companies that will do dual mass bolts just because they're cheap and they work. Keltec is one. Keltec doesn't have a great reputation. There's a reason for that. But when they've done dual mass designs, they tend to work okay. The Keltec Sub 2000 is a good example of that. It has a two-piece bolt. Now, it doesn't split along the bottom, it splits in line, but still cheaper to manufacture rather than having to mill the whole thing out. You just mill two separate parts independently that just basically slide together. And it works. It's cheap and it's effective. I'll give them that. So if you're going to do a cheap gun, this really is a good way to go. And while we're on the topic of this telescoping bolt, it is worth pointing out that one of the advantages of being able to put so much mass in the bolt without greatly widening it is that not only can you absorb a lot of recoil that way, and it really does, noticeably different, but it also holds that chamber closed for longer. Now, technically with a blowback gun, it starts to open up basically as soon as the round is fired. But how fast it opens up depends on how much mass is trying to keep that shell in place, the little casing. And with this one having so much mass out in front of the bolt proper, it keeps it closed, well, slows it down enough that you don't actually get a whole lot of blowback in the main part of the gun. Now, if you're running suppressed, that's going to be a different story. But unsuppressed, which is how I was running it, the main internals of the gun didn't get really dirty, and I put about 120 rounds through it, which isn't a ton, but 120 rounds through my CZ Scorpion turns the insides black. I can't really see anything. And this one, it was actually relatively clean. The chamber area itself was, of course, dirty. The bolt face was dirty, but the rest of the internals, were just fine. It looks like they looked like they had just been cleaned recently. It didn't take very long to clean this gun at all because of that, because the only areas that I had to really worry about was the barrel, the bolt face, and a little bit around the chamber area. That was it. That was the only thing that got any significant kind of carbon buildup, gunpowder residue at all. The rest of it was very, very, very clean. And even the magazines. These magazines I haven't cleaned, but they didn't develop a lot of gunpowder residue on the side either. My CZ Scorpion magazines, they are awful with that. It just gets all over in there. My CZ Scorpion is a very reliable gun. It does what I want it to do, but it is a very dirty gun. This one, by comparison, tends to shoot very, very cleanly. It just does not get as dirty. But that does also bring me to one of the downsides that I forgot to mention before. The tolerances on this one, even though you saw me slide the bolt in and it didn't go in with too much problems, the tolerances on this are relatively tight, which means that this design is going to be more susceptible to maintenance issues than, say, my CZ Scorpion. My CZ Scorpion, if I wanted to, not that I would, but if I wanted to, I could go thousands upon thousands of rounds without needing to clean that thing. It has pretty loose tolerances. It's kind of like the AK of the 9mm world. It just runs and 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 runs. Fairly loose tolerances, all the dirt and grime that builds up in there, and there's a lot that builds up in there, gets pushed to the edges pretty easily to places in the gun where they're not going to affect anything. But in this one, and my neighbors are not home right now, so don't freak out, and by the way, obviously the gun's unloaded, but the tolerances inside are just so tight that there's really no place that dirt and grime has to go. Now, like I said, this gun doesn't shoot very dirty, at least unsuppressed. If you shoot it suppressed, that's going to be a different story. But unsuppressed, it doesn't shoot very dirty, so it's okay. But once it does start to get dirty, there's just really no room in there for the dirt to go anywhere. And so I would not expect this to be a gun that you would want to take for very long without cleaning it. I always suggest that you make sure you clean your guns regularly. Anyways, anytime you take them out and shoot them, go ahead and clean them. Get a lot longer life out of them, a lot more reliable that way. But this one, you definitely want to keep up on your maintenance just because the tolerances are so tight. But still, good design in the bolt. Telescoping bolt was a great way to go. Really helps with absorbing the recoil, and it helps to keep the gun from getting too dirty, at least unsuppressed. Really, really a smart design choice there. And I do have another gun that is also has a telescoping bolt on it. My little Keltec CMR 30. Again, it's a trait that you tend to see in a lot of the cheaper guns, but it works. Very little recoil on that gun as well. Of course, it's 22 Magnum, so it's not going to have a ton, but even for 22 Magnum, it's still pretty light recoiling, and I can just hammer in place with that thing. It's absolutely fun. Absolute blast. Love it. And this gun, once I'm able to get some kind of a third point of contact on it, some kind of a stock or a brace or something like that, I anticipate that I'm going to be able to hammer targets pretty well with it as well. Very quickly be able to get back on sight, get my sight picture back with it, get back on target pretty quickly. So kudos to them on doing the telescoping bolt. That really was a good design. It's cheap, but it is very effective. And also, while we're on the internals, the trigger that is in here looks basically like an AR trigger. And I've heard some people say, I haven't been able to verify it myself, but I've heard some people say that some, if not all of the components actually are interchangeable with some AR triggers. I'm not exactly sure which ones. You'd probably want to get on a message board somewhere that talks about Stribogs and see if anyone's actually done any swapping. But the fact that it's in a metal chassis and the parts look like they'd be relatively interchangeable might make that something that would be of interest for you. And then also, like ARs, it's relatively easy to drop the hammer manually, and allows you to actually clean under the hammer real well, oil the pieces in there that you need to oil and all that. So I do actually kind of like that hammer configuration. It's kind of a funny looking hammer, but I do like that hammer configuration. It works quite well actually. So I'll want to give them credit for that. I like the fact that they went with something that was AR style. Fairly familiar, those kinds of things. That was a good design on their part. won't knock them for that. All right, and I've already talked about the back end being pretty easy to take apart. I've already talked about the trigger and hammer assembly basically being AR as far as I can tell, and I've heard other people say that they actually do in fact take some of the AR hammers and triggers. I'm not sure which ones, but they do take some of them. So good on that. And then as far as controls, the controls are also fairly AR-ish as well, and I actually do like the AR controls, at least in the sense that I'm used to them. Some things I don't like about them, but for the most part I like AR controls. And you see the safety here is that very typical AR 90-degree throw. Now this does occur on both sides of the gun. It is ambidextrous. It feels very plasticky, to be honest. It's not exactly the highest quality safety in the world. It's very plasticky. It actually wiggles back and forth in the frame a little bit. So again, not super high quality, but it works. And it actually has one of the features about the CZ Scorpion that I like. On the CZ Scorpion, when you flip down the safety on the other side, of course, flips down as well because it's ambi, and it hits your trigger finger. This one, when I flip the safety on the other side, that part will get in the way of my trigger finger. So if my trigger finger is actually, doing what it would do in shooting, it's actually going to be resting right on the safety. And what that reminds me of is the simple fact that my gun is not on safe. And if I take my trigger finger and actually index it up, it's going to be right on top of that safety there, and very conscious reminder that your gun is not on safe. Now this one is not nearly as annoying as the CZ one, because the CZ one sticks out quite a bit further. The Scorpion safety is pretty noticeable, pretty marked. This one, it's enough to feel it, but it's not so super annoying that you're going to wind up hacking it off like people do on the Scorpion. I really wish people wouldn't do that. It's actually a good design feature of me to encourage you to put the safety on when not in use. But lots of other people will take the safeties and they'll trim off the offside that they're not using so it doesn't interfere with the trigger finger. But this one is low profile enough that I think most people are going to keep it on there. Yes, it does touch. Yes, you are going to feel it, and it is a little bit annoying, but it's supposed to be, to let you know that your gun's not unsafe. So good design on that. And then while we're at it, the magazine release is kind of a good and a bad thing. Good thing about it is that it's at a fairly natural index point. Bad thing about it is that it's at a fairly natural index point. So if I'm indexing my trigger finger up and I happen to flinch for some reason, the instinct will of course be to clench your hand, and that includes that finger as well, and then you drop the magazine. That's one of the problems that I have with the AR. AR mag release button is in a good spot. It's easy to get to. But the fact that it's in a good spot can also become a liability. And also just like with the AR design, I've talked about this as well, this button works perpendicular to the plane of the gun. You push in. And so if anything bumps it, you can drop the mag that way as well. Now this one is better than an AR mag release in that it is not nearly as pronounced as an AR mag release. An AR mag release, you really do need to have a good fence around it to keep things from accidentally bumping it. This one's not as bad. And then another nice feature about it is that it's horizontal, whereas the AR's is vertical. The horizontal one doesn't tend to get bumped as much when you're setting it down on something that little, fairly small profile relative to the motion that you're making. Helps prevent a lot of those kinds of things from happening. So it does tend to stay out of the way pretty decently. Not perfect, but I will say that it is better than an AR's mag release. Now technically this one is ambidextrous, but in like the weirdest way possible. So on the other side of the gun here, you have a mag release as well, and you'll notice that this mag release is significantly longer than the other one. Okay, so right hand mag release, small. Left hand mag release is huge. And I find it very ironic that they put this big old fence around it, which usually is there to protect it from accidentally getting pushed. But the part that they put the fence around actually isn't the part that you push, it's the back end. And on this side, it actually acts like a lever. That is actually coming out. I don't know how well you can or cannot see that. Let's see if you can see that at all. There we go. Yeah, it's actually, you push down on the back end and the front end comes up. So it acts as a lever. and you have this fence around it that is not going to do any good because it's the back end that activates it. But the problem with this lever design is that it doesn't always work. I'll see if I can reproduce the error here, but with my left hand, sometimes it won't come out. Yep, there we go. Now it's locked up. I'm pushing with my index finger on my opposite side. Pushing, 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 pushing. Magazine is not coming out. Now when it does that, I can, with my other hand, come and push on it a little bit, and then it'll come out. But as far as getting the magazine to drop free using the left hand, doesn't do it. So a lot of times it will come out with the left hand just fine. Like that, it did just fine. But sometimes it'll lock up and you actually have to come in and tap it to get it to come out. Is that a big deal? Personally, I don't think it's a huge thing. And when I was out there shooting it, I actually wound up using that side of the mag release most often. I would shoot, and then I would tilt the gun, holding it in my right hand, tilt the gun up, hit the mag release while I was holding the magazine, and it would always come out when I did that. You sometimes have to apply a little bit of pressure to the magazine to get it to come out, but that's how I'd usually load and unload. So it didn't wind up being a big thing. But as far as drop free, not reliable. Does not consistently drop free. So take that for what it is. But overall, it certainly is more ambidextrous than an AR is, because they actually did something back there. And I like that it's horizontal instead of a vertical button. I didn't tend to have any major problems with it getting accidentally bumped. With ARs I do. This one I didn't, even though it is acting, the button acts perpendicular to the plane of the gun. I still don't have that problem, so I think the horizontal orientation was good on that. Just wish that the left hand side really did function better. But such as it is. And I can't remember if I mentioned it in this one or not. I've done multiple takes of this video, so forgive me if I repeat stuff. But when I was out there shooting it, initially I started out with kind of a pistol grip on it, and that end is really front heavy. And you guys know how I feel about front heavy things. If you watch my AR video, you know I don't like front heavy things. And so I took to grabbing it by the front and around the mag well. And as you can see, there is some stippling on the mag well. That is Grand Power anticipated that people would be holding their Stribog by the mag well. And it actually turns out that it works pretty decently well. Now there's this mag well is pretty well flared out there, so I can't really rest on that, so I kind of split the difference with my fingers around it. A couple below the lip, a couple above the lip. And it's kind of hurts on the other side because that's pretty angular, and so it digs into your palm meat just a little bit. But provides a pretty good gripping surface. That stippling definitely does help. And when you hold it out like that, it's actually not bad at all. And I was able to get, like I said, decent accuracy out to 25 yards, even using the cheap little notch sights that it has. That was pretty amazing and pretty cool. And holding it at the front end like there wasn't bad. I still plan on putting something on the back end to get that extra third point of contact, but not as bad as I thought it was. It was actually pretty decent. Like I said, the angular corner does dig into you a little bit when you do that magazine well hold, but you can get a pretty good solid grip on it and get decent follow-up shots and whatnot with it that way. So I was happy about that. So good to them on that one. And while we're talking about that magazine well, while it's a little annoying to hold on to just because it's so flared out, that magazine well flare does make it pretty easy to always get that magazine in pretty much no matter what angle you come at it from. It's pretty easy to slide it in place. Now there's different ways that different companies have done that over the years. One of the easiest and probably best solutions, especially on a pistol caliber gun, is just to put the magazine in the actual handle, so you have the whole hand meets hand things that the Israelis were really fond of, and there was good practicality to it. As far as being able to find something in the dark and being able to replace it, hand meets hand is a good way to do it. But if you can't do hand meets hand, having a really nicely flared magazine well is probably your second best option. And the Grand Power Stribog does a pretty good job of that. again, this plastic on the bottom here is fairly thin. It's not super high quality plastic, but the fact that it's so flared out does mean that you can get that magazine in pretty much no matter what. Even in the dark, you're going to be able to find it. I'm just closing my eyes to see what that would be like. A little bit of difficulty. You can get it though. A little bit of practice. Practice makes perfect, but it is better than it is with, say, my CZ. My CZ has a little bit of a flare on its magazine well, but not as much as this. And that is not one that I'd want to operate in the dark that way unless I had to, you know. And this one I certainly wouldn't want to do in the dark either, but I'd feel a little bit more comfortable with this one. So good on that. All right, drop the unloaded magazine. And let's see here. So I've talked about most of the stuff on the bottom end here. I will talk about that bolt release though. While the bolt release is pretty much the cheapest thing you could possibly get, because it's just a piece of sheet metal that's been bent over and has that little spring in it, that little spring hook thing that keeps it down, it actually works relatively well, and it's pretty easy to activate with your index finger. And that little piece of spring steel does move the bolt out of the way when it's supposed to be, even upside down, as you just saw. So it is functional, it does work. I just don't like them having that one weird little piece of metal sitting right there in the chassis where it can get caught on things. Usually my bore snake. I've had that happen a couple of times now, and it's not too hard to get undone. You know, you take something and rebend it back into place and whatnot, but you rebend steel like that, it'll eventually break on you, and that's not super fun to think about. And it's not a super critical part. You know, without, you know, a gun that doesn't have a bolt stop in it is not a dead gun. It just means that it doesn't have a last round hold open, so it might not be that big of a thing, but it actually is in a fairly convenient place. And then for magazine changes, because the bolt would lock back, and even with my relatively light defensive round, my 80 grain defensive rounds, it still held back on those as well, which was really amazing. But after I would get done replacing the magazine, I could just come and grab the bolt release with my thumb. I'll go ahead and drop it here, but go ahead and grab it with my thumb. Whoops, what did I do? There we go. Just didn't get the right leverage. Let's go ahead and try that again. All right, so go, grab, and works just fine that way, so no major issues. I have seen some companies come out with a version of the bolt stop that flares out just a little bit more, because as you could see there, I had a little bit of a hard time getting a proper grip on it to yank on it, and so depending on the conditions, you might not want to go that. Personally, I don't put a whole lot of stock in the bolt stop itself. I actually prefer the charging handle, just push back on the charging handle and use that, but to each their own on that one. They can do what they do. But it is a functional bolt stop. The sheet metal part of it doesn't bug me as much, because there's plenty of guns out there that have basically been made of you know, stamped sheet metal that's been bent around and whatnot. The AK is a good example of that. It has plenty of stamped sheet metal parts. What mostly bugs me is that spring that activates the bolt release. That to me is just janky upon janky. It does what it's supposed to do. It moves the bolt release out of the way automatically. But yeah, that really is a hang-up for me. I do not like that, in case you couldn't tell. But on the plus side of things, and also kind of on the minus side of things, on the new versions of the Stribog, it has the M-lock mounts on the front end. Kind of. This back one has part of the barrel assembly sticking in it, and so the back M-lock slot you can't actually entirely use. You can't use the back end of it because it has a little piece of the barrel assembly right behind the M-lock slot, and so you can't stick anything in there. So you get the front one and basically half of, so the front one and then half of the back one, but the rear end of the back M-lock slot you can't do because there's part of the barrel assembly right behind it. So kind of cool, but still kind of a fail. And then last but not least, and this one actually I think it was a good decision on Grand Power's part, is the charging handle. On these new versions, the charging handle is non-reciprocating, which is a big plus. The early versions it was reciprocating, and lots of people would hold their thumb fairly high and wind up getting hit by the charging handle when it came by. And then, the C-clamp warrior people, as one reviewer put it, that obviously will hurt. And so they made it a non-reciprocating charging handle, which was really a smart design. And like pretty much all of the other controls, it is either ambidextrous or swappable. So I'll go ahead and show you how to do that here. We need to take apart the gun. And is this easy enough to swap out to be considered field swappable? I actually do feel that it would be, because taking down the gun isn't too many parts. There's the back ends, and of course if you have a brace or a stock attached to it, that'll come out with it. That'll all be one piece. Then you take out the bolts, and then you get to the charging handle, and you kind of have to hold it in just the right place. There we go. If you can get it in the right place, then it'll pop out. Yay! And then you can slide it into the other side. And I slid it a little bit too far, so I'm going to have to slide it back a little bit, kind of play with it to see what will move up and down. And that's how you change it across. It's not too hard. I'm going to go ahead and put it back the other way because I am in fact right-handed. So I'll go ahead and put it back on the side that I'll use it on. But not too hard to change. And like I said, I would consider it to be field swappable. Yes, you do have to take out the bolt to get to it, but not ultimately all that big of a deal. Oops. And the reason why it wasn't going in is because it's part of that dual mass thing. It slid out a little bit, so I'm going to reline here. There we go. There. Make sure that buffer that likes to come out is properly seated. There we go. Slide my base plate back on. Push the pin through. Good. So yeah, I do like that the charging handle is first non-reciprocating, and it's relatively easy to swap out. Easy enough that I would consider it to be field swappable. You still have to take apart the gun to do it, but it's a whole lot easier to change out than some other ones I've seen, so I'll give them credit on that. And of course something that you can do without any tools whatsoever. I just did it here and I didn't have any fancy tools or anything, so we're good. That is all well and good. One last thing to mention before I sign out here, and that is the trigger pull. Of course this gun is empty, but we'll go ahead and show the trigger pull here. There's not a whole lot of take up. You're pretty much right into the pressure, and then it releases. And as you can see, that trigger does not move very much at all. So I'll go ahead and I'll hold it back. Not a super audible reset, but very tactile. I could definitely feel that. And then again, not much pre-travel whatsoever. You're pretty much right into it, and it breaks pretty crisply and cleanly. It's not bad at all. I actually like that trigger quite a bit. Like I said though, this trigger, as far as I can tell, does appear to be swappable with some AR triggers out there. So if you don't like it, there's a good chance that you might be able to swap it out for something else that you might like more. But I am probably more excited about the trigger than anything else, just because I'm used to my CZ Scorpion. My CZ Scorpion has like an 8 to 10 pound trigger pull in it. This one is probably a little bit closer to 5, maybe 6 pounds, but probably closer to 5 on this particular one. Very manageable compared to 8 to 10 pounds. So I will take that all day. So overall impressions of the Grand Power Stribog. In the current version, not the best for range in the world, but it does work better than I thought it would do. Like I said, even with the little plasticky post and knot sights that it has on top there, 25 yards is not outside of the realm of possibility. Now, with an optic and with some kind of a brace or stock, I would imagine that it would be quite a bit further than that. But it's enough that it was at least better than the handgun that I had out there yesterday, testing it alongside. So take that for what it is. Not bad on that regard. The overall features of it are very functional. I will say that. It also does a really good job of mitigating recoil for a blowback gun. That telescoping bolt was a very smart move on their part. I cannot applaud them enough for that. If you're going to do a cheap blowback gun, do a telescoping bolt. Solves a lot of issues real well, keeps the gun relatively clean, which this one needs to be because the tolerances on it are so tight, but keeps the gun relatively clean, absorbs a lot of the recoil. Overall, a fantastic design. I definitely want to make sure that I applaud them for that they did not fail on at all. The overall ergonomics are pretty good. They're basically AR controls with a few modifications and twists of their own, but basically AR controls. If you're a lefty, the left side mag release does not always work. Sometimes you have to give it a little bit of an assist. Like I said, if it doesn't release the first time, you just have to come and put a little bit of tension on the magazine, and that'll get it to release. So not drop-free, workable, but not drop-free. And so, oh yeah, overall that's my impressions of the gun. It is functional, it is workable. I do like it. It might not come across like I like it. I actually do like it. But it is very obvious, even though I do like it, it is very obvious that it is a cheaply made gun. Okay. There's a reason why it doesn't cost as much as the CZ Scorpion. Now, it is, I would say, higher quality than some of the other really cheap 9mm carbine-ish type guns that are out there. I think that this will be overall in the long term a better performer than, say, easily a better performer than the High Point 9mm carbine. What is that? The 995 or something like that. Definitely better than that, especially in terms of being able to take it apart. The Kel-Tec Sub 2000, I am familiar with that platform, and this will be more reliable than that just because the Stribog has a double feed magazine, whereas the Kel-Tec Sub 2000 has a single feed magazine system, and so this will be more reliable. But and this one also has last round hold open and things like that. And so in terms of those features, better. But in terms of just functioning as a gun, shooting when you want to shoot, that kind of thing, the Sub 2000 I would not count out. Yes, this is a better gun, but the Sub 2000 is a contender. It doesn't have last round hold open like this one does. The Sub 2000 has a crossbolt safety, which I don't like. I actually really like this 90-degree throw there. That's not bad at all. I do like that. And the Kel-Tec Sub 2000 is a little bit difficult to take apart. It does have quite a few pieces and parts, but you still don't need any special tools for it. It's a little complicated, but you don't need any special tools for it, unlike the High Point. Well, how special the tools you need with High Point is debatable, but some of the High Points you actually do need special tools for. The carbine, maybe not so much, but they're usually fairly complicated. But the Kel-Tec Sub 2000 I wouldn't take out of the running. Kel-Tec Sub 2000 got a lot of things right. The biggest thing I don't like about the Kel-Tec Sub 2000 is just that it's very difficult to mount optics to it. Whereas this one has a nice Picatinny rail on top. It's pretty easy to figure out how to mount optics to it. But I wouldn't take the Sub 2000 out of the running. In terms of quality, the CZ Scorpion is still going to beat it. They have better magazines, overall better construction, thicker, more durable parts, etc., etc. In terms of long-term reliability and durability, the CZ Scorpion is going to be tops. Also, in terms of like mud testing and things like that, the CZ Scorpion is going to do better just because it seals up a lot better. This one has literally this whole front end is open up, and that's all ingress points. And I would not expect this to do overly well in the mud and things like that, compared to the CZ, which is pretty closed up. So that's kind of the spectrum of it. It's definitely worse than the CZ in overall quality. Definitely better than the high point, and as far as the sub 2000, it's better than the sub 2000, and that it has, you know, last round hold open, things like that. Definitely a lot easier to mount optics too. But in terms of bang for your buck, the Kel-Tec sub 2000 is actually probably better in that regard, provided you can get around the optics mounting issue. So yeah, that's where I would put it on the scale, at least as it is now. Now, once I get a, you know, either a stock or a brace on the back end and get an optic on it, my opinion of it might go way up, or it might be just kind of meh. But so far, I would say that it is a good gun for the money. But the question is, do you want to spend a little bit more and get that much better gun, or do you want to spend a little bit less and just not have some of the nice features? This one has pretty nice takedown. It does have last round hold open. It does have fairly good ergonomics that are very AR-like. If those things aren't super important to you, you know, sub 2000 isn't too terrible. Yeah, the recoil on the sub 2000 is not great to deal with and those kinds of things, but it's a very functional gun. On all of the examples that I've seen, sub 2000 in 9mm, I wouldn't recommend the 40 caliber. 40 caliber 40 caliber guns that were converted from 9mm designs usually don't work out super very well to begin with, and then you throw Kel-Tec's weirdness on top of that, and Kel-Tec is not super consistent. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend the 40 caliber sub 2000s, but the 9mm sub 2000s seem to be just fine. And I know someone that actually got them, was able to acquire a sub 2000 for them, and they've shot it multiple times now, and it's still running just fine. It's a little ammo sensitive because it's a single feed system, and so you have to be a little careful about that. But for what it is, it's just fine. But this one does have additional features, so you got to weigh that. Like I said, it does have a last round hold open. It is easier to mount optics too. It's also more expensive, and it also does have better ergonomics. But yeah, so it's a cheap gun that has some of the more expensive gun features, and so for a lot of people, I think it'll be a good compromise, but maybe not quite enough to get some people out of the sub 2000 range. But that's what it is. It is what it is. As far as price, of course, it varies, and recently there's been quite a bit of run on Stribogs just because there have been people who've been put out quite a few reviews on them, and that's up to popularity, and they'll put out promo codes and whatnot, and it tends to drive up the prices in the end. So right now, to get a base model like this one that doesn't have anything on the end, you're looking at around $600, $650, somewhere in there. And then for a version that would actually have like a brace, or I don't think I've seen any commercially available with stocks on them because the barrel's too short. If Grand Power ever decided to do a long barrel version, they might come out with a proper stock as well. But right now it's either this base version or the version with a pistol brace on it, the pistol stabilizing brace, according to the ATF. But the version with the brace on it is usually going to run somewhere between $800 and $850. So $600 to $650 for the base gun, and then basically add $200 for the brace, more or less, is how it's been going recently. But yeah, those are my thoughts and my opinions on the Grand Power Stribog, or Stribog, or however you want to say it. Good money for the price. Good gun for the price. Definitely has a lot of cheap components in it. If you're looking for high quality, this is not the gun. If you're looking for something that is going to be good enough for the right price, it just might be. That's my opinion. Thank you all very much for your time and attention. Bye-bye.